What if I told you that for a good chunk of the Middle Ages, Europeans actually loved bathhouses? That bathing was often a social event complete with food, drinks, and games? And that even kings traveled with their own personal bathtubs? So grab your loofah, because today we're digging deep into the historical record to uncover the complex truth about medieval hygiene. It's a story that's much richer, stranger, and yes, surprisingly steamier than the myths suggest. Everyday hygiene. Alright, first things first, let's tackle the idea that medieval folks just wallowed in grime. While they certainly didn't have our modern conveniences, they absolutely had hygiene routines. Cleanliness just looked different, often focusing on what was practical and visible. Hand washing, for instance, was a big deal. This makes sense, right? In an era before forks were common for most people, eating was a hands-on affair. Washing hands before and after meals wasn't just polite. It was basic etiquette across social classes, a sign of respect and civility. Dedicated washing stations, called lavabos, were standard features in monasteries, showing the ritual importance placed on clean hands. Beyond hands, daily routines often included washing the face and rinsing the mouth. How did they manage oral hygiene without Colgate? They got resourceful. Teeth might be rubbed clean using simple tools like frayed hazel twigs or pieces of linen cloth. Sometimes they used mixtures of herbs and salt as rudimentary toothpaste, or rinsed with mouthwashes made from vinegar or water steeped with cloves to freshen breath. Hair care was also part of the routine. Combing, often with wood or horn combs, was essential, not just for looks, but to combat the rampant problem of lice and fleas in densely populated areas. While washing the entire head of hair wasn't likely a daily ritual for most, it wasn't unheard of. Medical advice sometimes recommended washing hair every few weeks using water and herbal preparations, and wealthier folks might even employ servants specifically for the task. Religious attitudes towards the body were also evolving. Forget the idea that all holy people embraced dirt. By the 13th century, influential texts like Ancre en Vis, a guide for religious women living in solitude, explicitly advised, wash yourself whenever there is need. Filth was never dear to God, though poverty and plainness are pleasing. This marks a significant shift, acknowledging cleanliness as compatible with, and perhaps even part of, a devout life. Clothing hygiene was another aspect. Clothes were washed, often in rivers or large wooden tubs, sometimes using basic soap made from animal fat and wood ashes, though this harsh soap was typically reserved for laundry and not skin. Cleaning the skin itself relied on the water, steam, and vigorous rubbing. For those who could afford them, linen undergarments were crucial. Linen was valued for its ability to absorb sweat and body oils, and because it could be washed more easily and frequently than heavy wool outer garments. Having changes of clean linen became a primary way for the better off to maintain a sense of personal freshness. Practices also varied significantly across Europe. Some early medieval English writers, for example, actually considered the Vikings to be excessively concerned with cleanliness because they reportedly bathed once a week. This reminds us that there wasn't one single medieval standard, but rather a spectrum of habits influenced by local culture, climate, and resources. So while it wasn't about daily showers and deodorant, medieval people had established routines focusing on hands, face, hair, and clothing, especially the parts others would notice. Rise of the public bathhouse. Alright, let's talk about the main event, the bathhouse. Now, for the really surprising part, for several centuries in the High Middle Ages, public bathhouses weren't just present, they thrived. Far from universally shunning water, many medieval Europeans enthusiastically embraced communal bathing. How did this happen after the decline of Roman bathing culture? One compelling theory points to the Crusaders. Returning from campaigns in the East, they likely encountered the established tradition of Turkish baths, or hammams, and brought back favorable reports, perhaps even a newfound appreciation for a good soak. Whatever the exact trigger, bathhouses began appearing across Europe. Records show Paris boasted over 24 bathhouses in the late 13th century. And London had a well-known cluster near Southwark. Even smaller towns had their own establishment, sometimes cleverly built near bakeries to utilize the excess heat for warming the water. In some German-speaking regions, bathhouse owners were organized enough to form their own respected guilds, and city ordinances sometimes regulated their upkeep. These weren't just functional places to get clean, they were bustling social hubs. Think of them as combining a spa, a community center, and maybe even a cafe or pub. People gathered in the warm, steamy rooms, often sitting together companionably in large wooden tubs, to socialize, chat, play games like dice or chess, conduct business, eat, and drink. Some sources, like Boccaccio's Decameron, paint vivid pictures of the bathhouse experience, sometimes depicting idyllic, even romantic encounters in private rooms, complete with scented soaps, wine, and sweetmeats. Beyond bathing, these establishments often offered other services: haircuts, shaves, beard trimming, and sometimes even minor medical procedures like bloodletting or lancing boils. Bathing was sometimes even seen as therapeutic for certain ailments, especially in mineral springs, based on the medical ideas of the time. In parts of Germany, it was common for employers to give their workers Badegeld, bath money, as a perk or part of their wages. Now, the atmosphere could be quite informal, especially north of the Alps. Norms around nudity were different then. Mixed bathing, or at least bathing where men and women were in close proximity and view of each other, occurred. An Italian scholar named Poggio Bracciolini, visiting the famous spa town of Baden in Switzerland in the early 15th century, wrote with astonishment about seeing men and women, including monks and nuns, mingling freely, naked or nearly so, chatting, eating, gambling, and even touching, sometimes apparently without concern from spouses or relatives nearby. It was a scene of communal ease and bodily acceptance, quite alien to later, more prudish sensibilities. Let me know in the comments if you knew about this. Private bathing for the elite. But what if you were rich enough to skip the crowds altogether? While public baths served the townsfolk, the truly wealthy, royalty, high nobility, top clergy, often enjoyed the luxury of private bathing facilities within their castles, manors, or palaces. Some grand residences even had sophisticated two-room bathing suites, occasionally heated by Roman-style hypocaust systems under the floor. But for most private baths, there was no running hot water. Getting a bath ready was a major chore for the servants. Imagine them hauling bucket after bucket of water, heating it over large fires, filling a heavy wooden tub, sometimes large enough for multiple people, and then emptying it all afterwards. An English household manual from around 1430, The Book of Nurture by John Russell, gives incredibly detailed instructions for bathing one's lord. Hang sheets soaked in sweet herbs around the tub, provide special sponges to sit on, rinse him with warm rose water, dry him thoroughly, and then put him straight to bed to recover from the ordeal. The experience could be quite lavish. We even know that King John of England, despite his reputation, thought bathing important enough to travel with his own portable bathtub in the early 13th century. And interestingly, even in these private settings, the concept of privacy wasn't the same as ours. Sharing a bath with a family member or even guests wasn't necessarily considered strange or improper. Why the fear? Disease, morals, and money. Okay, so if bathing was popular for a while, enjoyed by the rich and poor alike, why the later reputation for avoiding water? And why did these bustling bathhouses eventually close down in many places? What went wrong? It seems a perfect storm of factors brewed towards the end of the Middle Ages and into the 16th century. Number 1, and perhaps the biggest factor, was disease. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century brought unimaginable terror and death. In the absence of germ theory, doctors relied on the idea of miasmas, or bad air spreading illness. They developed a strong theory that bathing, especially in warm water, was dangerous because it opened the pores of the skin. This, they believed, made the body vulnerable, allowing the poisonous plague-like carrying air to enter easily and disrupt the body's vital balance of humors. Public bathhouses, being warm, moist, and crowded, suddenly looked like deadly traps. The Paris medical faculty, asked to investigate the plague's origins in 1348, specifically warned against baths for this reason. Later, the devastating emergence and spread of syphilis in the late 15th century further cemented the association between bathhouses and disease, adding a layer of moral panic. Number 2 involved morals and religion. Even before the major plague outbreaks, the church had expressed concerns about the goings-ons in some bathhouses. The frequent mixing of sexes, the nudity, and the undeniable fact that some establishments became fronts for prostitution drew criticism. For some religious figures and devout laypeople, spending hours in luxurious, potentially licentious environments seemed like worldly vanity at best and sinful temptation at worst. Furthermore, the tradition of asceticism, where individuals sought holiness through self-denial, sometimes included deliberately avoiding washing as a way to mortify the flesh. And finally, there were simple practical and economic problems. Heating the vast amounts of water needed for the bathhouses required enormous quantities of firewood. As forests were depleted over centuries, wood became increasingly scarce and expensive. Bathhouse owners, often restricted by law from raising entrance fees significantly, struggled to cover the costs. We see records of bathhouses in cities like Basel closing down over time due to these pressures. And for the average peasant or laborer, already working long, hard hours, the sheer time, effort, and expense involved in seeking out and paying for a bath, or in hauling and heating water at home, made frequent full-body bathing an impractical luxury. So, this powerful combination, intense fear of deadly diseases linked to bathing, growing moral and religious objections, and straightforward economic and practical challenges ultimately led to the widespread decline of the medieval bathhouse culture in Western Europe. This set the stage for the next few centuries, where the definition of clean shifted dramatically towards fresh linen rather than washed skin. If you're finding this surprising, hit that like button. So, there you have it. The Middle Ages weren't just about muck and misery. People had specific hygiene routines, cared about visible cleanliness, and for a glorious, steamy interlude, public bathing was a surprisingly central and social part of life. But very real fears about devastating diseases combined with shifting moral codes and the practical hurdles of the time meant the story of medieval cleanliness is far from a simple tale of universal grime. It's a fascinating example of how our most basic habits are shaped by the world around us. What part of medieval hygiene blew your mind the most? Was it the social bathing, the fear of open pores, or something else? Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this dip into the surprising side of cleanliness, hit that like button and subscribe. Check out my sources below. See you in the next one.